The morning they signed her over, Adeline Prue was 21 years old and owed $43 she'd never borrowed. The debt belonged to her uncle, Fletcher, who had borrowed against her name at the land office in Caldwell 3 years prior, when she was still a girl and didn't know her signature could be taken from her while she slept. She found out the same way she found out about most things that mattered. Too late, in a room full of men who had already decided, with the papers already dry. The man sitting across the table from her uncle was named Cutter Vane, not young, not old. Somewhere in the middle where life had pressed itself into a person and left permanent marks. He had the build of a man who had spent 15 years lifting things that were too heavy, and the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting the world to be fair and had simply adjusted accordingly. He ran a cattle operation up on the Cimarron Breaks, 3 hours northeast of Caldwell in the Red Clay Hill country, where the wind never stopped and the summers cracked the earth open like old leather. He had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. The youngest was 4. The oldest was 14 and, from what little Adeline had heard, already meaner than his father. Fletcher didn't look at her when he slid the papers across the table. The land office clerk, a small damp man named Pritchard, who smelled of tobacco, spit, and ink, cleared his throat and said the arrangement was entirely legal. A domestic contract, common enough in the territory. He said it like he was discussing the price of corn. Adeline looked at the number written in black ink on the transfer agreement. $43.16, the exact price of her next 4 years. She picked up the pen, she signed, not because she had a choice, because she'd already spent 2 weeks turning the situation over in her mind like a stone in a creek, looking for another angle, and there wasn't one. Fletcher owed the debt. The debt was secured against her labor. Cutter Vane held the note. If she refused to go, Vane could call the note and Fletcher would lose the 40 acres he'd spent 11 years breaking. Adeline's mother was buried on that land. She set the pen down. Cutter Vane didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He folded his copy of the papers, tucked them into his coat pocket, stood up and walked out of the land office. Adeline followed him into the hard white light of a Kansas August noon. His wagon was a working wagon, not a courtesy wagon. The bed was half full of fence wire and grain sacks. There was no cushion on the buckboard seat, just bare splintered wood baked hot by the sun. He climbed up, unwrapped the reins from the brake handle, and looked back at her standing in the dust of the street. He didn't offer her a hand up. She climbed up on her own, tucking her bag between her feet, and stared straight ahead at the rump of 2 large bony roan horses. They left Caldwell without speaking. The first hour was flat, the road running straight through buffalo grass gone yellow and brittle under the August heat. The second hour climbed, the land breaking up into red clay ridges cut through with dry creek beds. The road got worse. The wagon rattled in the ruts, and the fence wire in the back clinked steadily. By the third hour, Adeline's spine felt like something was unscrewing it bolt by bolt. Cutter hadn't spoken since they left town. He drove with the reins loose in his hands, his eyes on the road, the brim of his hat pulled low against the glare. Finally, somewhere in the second hour, without looking at her, he spoke. "They don't know you're coming." Adeline turned her head. "The children? I told them I was bringing someone to help with the house. I didn't say who or what kind." He paused. "They haven't had a woman in the house since their mother left." Adeline caught the specific word. Not died, left. She filed that away and didn't ask. How long ago? 16 months. And the oldest? The boy. Cutter's jaw tightened under the dust and stubble. "His name is Decker. He's 14. He runs the younger ones, and he'll tell you that to your face inside of 10 minutes. He paused again. "Don't let him." Adeline looked back at the road. What happened to the last woman? The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "She lasted 11 days, he said. Decker made sure of that. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the ridge and throwing long orange shadows across the yard. It was bigger than she'd expected, not prosperous but serious. A main house of weathered board and batten, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a corral with 6 or 7 cattle shifting along the fence. The yard was hard-packed clay, scattered with rope ends and rusted equipment, and what appeared to be the skeleton of a dog kennel that had been dismantled and not rebuilt. Before the wagon reached the gate, the front door opened. Adeline's chest tightened. The boy came out first. Decker. He was tall for 14, lean in the way of boys who do real physical work, with his father's set jaw and his mother's absence burning in his eyes. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed and watched the wagon come in, with an expression that had clearly been arranged ahead of time. Behind him came the others in a loose cluster. A boy of about 11, sandy-haired, serious, a younger boy of 8 or so with a split lip that was a few days old, and a girl small, maybe 5, standing slightly behind the older boys, with her thumb pressed to her lower lip, watching Adeline with enormous brown eyes. Cutter pulled the wagon to a stop and got down. "This is Adeline," he said. "She'll be keeping the house." Nobody spoke. Decker looked at Adeline with the slow, measuring contempt of someone who had already decided and was simply confirming. His eyes went from her face to her single bag to her worn-out shoes and back to her face. "We don't need keeping," he said. Decker. Cutter's voice was flat and final. The boy's jaw worked. He turned and went back inside, letting the screen door slam behind him. Cutter looked at Adeline. He didn't apologize. He walked to the barn. Adeline stood in the yard with her bag. The 3 remaining children stared at her. The little girl still had her thumb against her lip. The 8-year-old with the split lip looked at her feet. The 11-year-old met her eyes steadily, assessing, not hostile, just measuring. "What's your name?" Adeline asked him. "Wren," he said. "The little one?" "Bertie." Adeline looked at Bertie. "Are you hungry?" Bertie's thumb came away from her lip just slightly. She nodded. Adeline picked up her bag. "Then let's figure out what's in that kitchen." She found out what was in the kitchen. Not much. Half a sack of dried beans, some hardtack, 3 potatoes going soft, a heel of salt pork wrapped in greasy cloth, and a cast-iron pot that hadn't been properly cleaned since the last time a woman had cleaned it, which was apparently 16 months ago. The kitchen itself told the whole story. Grease had built up on the stovetop in layers, each one a different shade of brown like rings in a tree. The floor was tracked with dried mud in a pattern that suggested nobody had swept in weeks. There were flies. There was a smell behind the smell of wood smoke that Adeline eventually traced to a bucket under the dry sink that had been there long enough to become its own ecosystem. She put the bucket outside. She filled a pot with water from the rain barrel. She started the beans. Decker came into the kitchen once, moving through like she wasn't there, and took a piece of hardtack off the shelf. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He left. Adeline watched the door swing shut behind him. She turned back to the beans. That first week was an education in hostility without drama. Decker had apparently learned that shouting and direct confrontation were less effective than the quiet removal of the things she needed. She'd find the kindling moved from where she'd left it. The water bucket relocated to the far end of the yard. The kitchen matches not where she'd last put them. Nothing dramatic enough to call out directly. Just the steady wearing down of someone who knew all the house's small mechanisms and had decided to put them to work against her. Wren watched her. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't helpful either. He was waiting to see which way things were going to go before committing. The 8-year-old, whose name turned out to be Gus, seemed to have decided to ignore her entirely, which she found almost restful compared to the other options. Bertie followed her. Not obviously. Not in a way that invited acknowledgement. The little girl would simply appear near whatever room Adeline was working in, sitting on the floor with a piece of rope or a dried corn cob, playing quietly and watching. The first time Adeline spoke to her directly, just asking her to hand over a rag, Bertie startled like a spooked cat and left the room. The second time she handed over the rag. Cutter came in for meals, ate, and left. He said functional things. "Where's the axe? Is there cornmeal left?" What happened to the fence pliers? Not hostile, not warm. Just the speech of a man who had stripped language down to what was load-bearing and dropped everything else. On the 5th night, Adeline was still awake at midnight, sitting at the kitchen table, trying to get the arithmetic right on the food stores against the weeks until the next supply run, when she heard him come in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. "Up," he said, which was observable fact, not conversation. "The numbers don't add up," she said, and turned the paper toward him so he could see what she'd written. He came in, looked at the page, and stood there reading for a moment. His hands on the table edge were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that came from wire and wood and years of hard use. I figured on a supply run in 3 weeks, he said. You'll be short before then. The boys eat more than you've accounted for. He looked at her. Not the livestock appraisal she'd gotten from half of Caldwell when they heard about the arrangement. Something else, like he was recalibrating something internal. I'll go in 2 weeks, he said. He straightened up and went to his room. Adeline sat with the paper a little longer. Then she put it away and went to bed. The crisis that broke everything open came in the second week. Gus didn't come to breakfast. That alone wasn't unusual. The 8-year-old had been practicing a studied indifference to Adeline's domestic rhythms since day one. But Wren came downstairs alone and looked at the empty chair with an expression that made Adeline set down the skillet. Where is he? Still upstairs, Wren said, which meant something because Wren said things carefully and exactly. She went up. Gus was on his side in the narrow bed, his face the color of old flour, the split lip now the least notable thing about his appearance. He was running a fever that she could feel from 2 feet away. When she put her hand on his forehead, his eyes opened slightly. Don't, he said, in the thin, ragged voice of a child who had been sick long enough to stop performing toughness. Don't what? Adeline said. He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. She went back downstairs to find Decker standing in the kitchen doorway. For the first time since she'd arrived, his face was different. The arrangement of contempt was gone, replaced by something rawer and less managed. It's his chest, Decker said. His voice came out half a register too high and he visibly adjusted it. He gets it. Tightness. He had it last winter too. Was there a doctor called? Decker's expression flickered with something. Vane doesn't call doctors. There was a canyon of things inside that sentence that Adeline didn't have time to excavate. What did your mother do when he got it? The question landed in the room like a dropped coal. Decker's face went rigid. For 3 full seconds he didn't breathe. Then, steam. Pine needles in the water. Kept him sitting up. Is there pine on this property? A pause. East draw. Show Wren where. Tell him to bring back the greener branches. I need the resin. Decker stared at her for another moment. Then he turned and went out the back door, and she heard him calling Wren across the yard. What followed was 36 hours that Adeline would later have difficulty accounting for in a linear way. The fever climbed through the first night. She built a steam tent over Gus's bed using the 2 largest wool blankets and a pot of boiling water laced with pine resin that Wren had brought back in armloads, his hands sticky with sap. She sat inside the tent with Gus, in the wet, suffocating heat, while he fought sleep and the rattling in his chest, and she held him up when his body wanted to slide down and made him breathe. Decker appeared in the doorway of the room every hour or 2 throughout the night. He didn't say anything. He would just look at the tent, look at Adeline's outline through the wool, listen to his brother's breathing, and leave. Around 3 in the morning, Gus said very quietly, "Am I going to die?" "No," Adeline said. "How do you know?" "Because you're already breathing better than you were 2 hours ago." "Hear that?" "That sound's gone." A silence. "I don't want to die before Decker," Gus said. "He'd never let me hear the end of it." Adeline, in spite of everything, almost laughed. By the second morning the fever had broken and the rattle was gone. Gus lay flat and pale and empty-looking. The way people looked after a body had finished burning through something serious. Adeline sat in the chair beside the bed, her hair loose and damp, her hands smelling of pine resin and camphor, every bone in her body made of something heavier than bone. She heard the back door open downstairs. She heard Cutter's boots on the stairs. He came into the room and stopped, took in Gus in the bed asleep, breathing, chest rising steadily, took in the wool blankets draped over the chair rail, took in Adeline. She looked back at him. She was too tired to arrange her face into anything particular. He walked to the bedside, looked at his son, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do since she'd arrived. He put his hand on the boy's head, gently, briefly. He straightened up. "You should sleep," he said. "I intend to," Adeline replied. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then he reached out and picked up the wool blanket from the chair rail and set it over her shoulders where she sat. It was a practical gesture. The room was cold. There was nothing sentimental about it, but his hands were careful. "I've got him now," he said. She slept in the chair for 4 hours, and when she woke, Cutter was still there, sitting on the edge of the bed, whittling a small piece of wood that was slowly becoming what appeared to be a horse, while Gus slept beside him. Things shifted after Gus got well. Not dramatically, not announced, just the quiet reorganization of a household that had been pointing its teeth outward, and suddenly cautiously wasn't. Decker didn't stop being difficult, but the difficulty changed in character. Less strategic, less the disciplined wearing down of a siege. More the ordinary friction of a 14-year-old boy who resented the world and had never been given any particular reason to believe that would change. Adeline found she could work with that. She knew that texture. She had felt it herself. Wren started helping with the wood, not asked. He just started doing it. She didn't make a production of it. Bertie began sitting at the table while Adeline cooked instead of in the doorway. That was the whole change. 3 feet closer, it felt like a significant distance. The supply run to town was set for a Saturday in late September, when the heat had finally broken, and the red clay had firmed back up after the first cool rains. Cutter said he was going to Meridian, which was bigger than Caldwell and farther, and he said it in a way that indicated she was coming. The town of Meridian was a cattle shipping town, which meant it had money and also had opinions. The main street ran straight and wide, the storefronts painted and serious, the boardwalks busy with people who had somewhere to be. Adeline had been to Meridian once years before with her mother. She had liked it then. Now she felt the town take notice of her as the wagon rolled down the main street, and the noticing had a specific texture she recognized. 2 months. Word had traveled, as word did. The mercantile was called Aldous Brothers, which was either a family name or an aspiration. The man behind the counter was thick through the shoulders with a short gray beard and eyes that summed people up by category before they'd finished coming through the door. He put Adeline in her category in about 4 seconds. "Cutter," he said, extending a hand to Cutter. Then, pointedly slower, "This the girl from Caldwell?" "Her name is Adeline," Cutter said, his voice carrying nothing in particular except the flat certainty of a man stating geography. The merchant, his own name appeared to be Aldous, the original, shifted his gaze to Adeline, with the curiosity of someone who had expected something and wasn't sure if he was looking at it. "I need 50 pounds of flour," Adeline said, 20 of cornmeal, salt pork if you have it, at least 15 pounds. I need soda, cream of tartar, and whatever dried fruit you're carrying. Also thread, heavy cotton, and a pair of the boys' boots if you have anything in a size 7. Aldous blinked. "And," she continued, looking at the shelf behind him, "your scale needs recalibrating. The plate arm is sitting a 1/4 inch low on the right side. You're underweighting every purchase where the seller isn't watching, and overweighting ours." The silence in the mercantile was total. Aldous' face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Cutter, standing behind her, said nothing. She could feel the stillness of him, different from his ordinary stillness, focused. "Now see here," Aldous started. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Adeline said, which was technically true and also completely a lie. "I'm telling you your equipment is off. It's possible you haven't noticed." She looked at him steadily. "I'd hate for there to be a misunderstanding." Aldous looked at the scale. He looked at Adeline. He looked at Cutter, who had crossed his arms across his chest and was looking at the tin ceiling with an air of complete detachment. "I'll have someone look at that," Aldous said. "Good," Adeline said. "I'll wait." She got the flour, the cornmeal, the salt pork, the soda, the cream of tartar, 2 pounds of dried apple, and the boys' boots. She did not get overcharged. She knew because she watched the scale. Outside, the wagon loaded, Cutter swung up beside her on the buckboard. He picked up the reins. He sat there for a moment before clicking the horses forward. "The scale," he said. "Was off," she confirmed. "How did you know that?" "My mother kept a store for 6 years in Pratt County. I grew up watching that exact trick." He looked at her, full on, for the first time in a way that wasn't transactional. She had gotten that look from people before, the look that came when they updated an internal file. She let him look. "He's been shorting me for 3 years, Cutter said. "Well," Adeline said, "not anymore." He made a sound, low, brief, almost involuntary. It took her a full second to understand it was a laugh. He snapped the reins. The horses moved. She was still facing forward, but she felt the shift in the air between them on the seat, the half-inch of space that had been careful and is now comfortable. She didn't remark on it. Some things you leave alone so they can settle into permanence without being disturbed. The ride back up into the breaks took the usual 3 hours. The light went amber and then deep gold, and then the particular shade of bruised purple that came after sunset in the hill country, the kind of sky that looked like it was apologizing for the heat of the day. The children were asleep in the back of the wagon, the 3 boys in a loose tangle around the supplies, Bertie tucked between 2 flour sacks with her hands folded under her cheek. Adeline sat with the evening settling around her and thought about the specific nature of the last 2 months. The debt was still on the paper. She was still Adeline Prue of the $43 arrangement, signed over in a land office while Pritchard sweated through his collar. None of that had changed on paper. But paper was one thing. She looked at Bertie sleeping between the flour sacks. She thought about Gus's voice in the steam tent, asking whether he was going to die, and the way he'd said Decker's name like it was a private joke they shared, the kind of joke that only existed between people who had been through things together. She thought about Decker that morning, coming to the kitchen before anyone else was up and eating the biscuits she'd made, while standing at the window with his back to her, not saying anything, but eating 3 of them. She thought about Cutter's hands, careful on the wool blanket. It wasn't a story she would have chosen. It wasn't a door she'd have walked through on her own. But she was here, and here it turned out had weight and shape and the specific texture of something that was becoming real. The wagon hit a rut, and her shoulder met Cutter's arm, and she didn't move away. And neither did he, and the horses pulled them steadily up the red clay grade into the dark of the breaks, toward the lights she could already see from the house she had learned to keep. She wasn't going back down.